In a land carved by violence and baked by an unforgiving sun, a lone woman's act of compassion was destined to ignite a firestorm. When the widow Bess McAllister dragged a stranger from the brink of death, his side pierced by a bloody arrow, she saw only a man in need. She was a healer, a survivor isolated on the vast Texas plains, where kindness was a currency more precious and far rarer than gold. But the man bleeding on her cot was no ordinary drifter, no simple victim of the frontier's casual cruelty. He was a secret that could get her killed, a phantom of the wilderness whispered about in fear around settlers' fires. She was about to learn that she was harboring a legend, the great war chief of the Comanche Nation. The Texas sun was a hammer beating down on the cracked earth with a relentless white-hot fury. It bleached the sky to a pale, washed-out blue and baked the very life from the sparse grasses, clinging to the rolling plains. For Mary Bess McAllister, the heat was just another fact of life, like the loneliness that had been her constant companion since the fever took her husband Robert 2 years prior. Her small ranch, a lonely outpost of stubborn defiance against the wilderness, was her entire world. It consisted of a sturdy one-room log cabin, a well-tended garden wrested from the stubborn soil, and a corral holding her mare Daisy, and a few head of hardy cattle. Life was a litany of chores, a rhythm of survival dictated by the sun and seasons. On this blistering afternoon, that rhythm was broken. Bess was riding the fence line near the sluggish brown waters of the Brazos River when Daisy suddenly shied her ears, swiveling nervously. Bess followed the mare's gaze to a dark shape, crumpled beneath the sparse shade of a cottonwood tree. Vultures were already beginning to circle high above patient black specks against the searing blue. Caution was a settler's most vital tool. Every shadow could hold a threat, a rattlesnake, a coyote, or something far more dangerous. Bess dismounted, pulling the Winchester from its scabbard on her saddle. Her heart thumped, a heavy, deliberate beat against her ribs as she approached her boots, kicking up puffs of fine, chalky dust. The shape was a man lying face down. He was Native American, dressed in worn buckskin leggings and a breechcloth. A single arrow fletched with dark hawk feathers protruded from his left side, just below the ribs. The area around the wound was a dark, saturated mess of blood and dirt. He was unnervingly still. For a long moment, Bess stood frozen, a war raging within her. The stories told in the nearby town of Redemption were a poison in the air, tales of Comanche raids of violence and terror. The common wisdom preached by men with hard eyes and rifles, never far from their reach, was to shoot first and ask questions never. Leaving him here meant certain death, a slow surrender to the heat and the scavengers. But helping him was a risk of a different kind, a deliberate invitation of the very danger she sought to avoid every single day. She thought of her father, a stern but decent preacher back in Missouri, who had taught her that compassion was not a choice, but a duty, a reflection of God's grace in a fallen world. She looked at the man's hand, fingers slightly curled in the dust, and saw not a savage, not an enemy, but a human being whose life was bleeding away into the parched Texas earth. The decision once made settled in her with a grim finality. She holstered her rifle. With a strength born of years of hard labor, she heaved the man's dead weight over her shoulders. He was heavier than he looked, a solid mass of muscle and bone. Grunting with the effort, she managed to lift him onto Daisy's back. The mare snorted and sidestepped, but Bess soothed her with a firm hand and a low voice, and she grudgingly accepted the burden. The journey back to the cabin was an agonizingly slow procession under the oppressive sun. With every jolt, a low groan escaped the man's lips, a sound that twisted something deep inside Bess. She felt a strange, fierce protectiveness, an irrational anger at whatever had brought him to this state. Inside the cool dimness of her cabin, she slid him carefully onto her own cot. The room was simple, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves holding her meager possessions, and the cot in the corner. It was a small space, and the presence of the stranger seemed to fill it entirely, charging the air with a new and potent energy. Now came the part she dreaded. The arrow had to come out. She gathered her supplies, a bottle of whiskey, a sharp, skinning knife that Robert had kept meticulously honed, and clean strips of cloth torn from an old bedsheet. She took a steadying breath and a small swallow of the raw whiskey herself, the fire of it clearing her head. She carefully cut away the buckskin around the wound. The arrowhead was barbed, a cruel design, meant to tear flesh upon removal. Pushing it through would be impossible. It had to be pulled. Wiping the knife with whiskey, she made a swift, shallow incision to widen the entry point, her movements practiced and sure. The man's body arched in a silent scream of agony, and his eyes fluttered open for a brief, unfocused moment, before closing again. "Hold on," she whispered as much to herself as to him. "Just hold on." Gripping the greasy arrow shaft with both hands, she planted her feet, closed her eyes, and pulled. It came free with a sickening wet sound that made her stomach clench. Blood flowed anew, dark and thick. She immediately pressed a whiskey-soaked cloth into the wound, applying firm pressure until the bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. She then packed it with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey from her garden herbs her mother had taught her, were good for staunching blood and knitting flesh, and bound it tightly with the clean strips of cloth. For the next 3 days, Bess was a prisoner in her own home, her life revolving around the stranger on her cot. He drifted in and out of a feverish delirium, muttering in a language that was all sharp consonants and soft vowels, a river of sound she could not comprehend. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and changed his dressing twice a day, noting with grim satisfaction that the angry redness around the wound was beginning to fade. In the long, silent hours she found herself studying him. His face in repose was a carving of stark lines and proud angles, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a mouth that even in unconsciousness seemed set in a line of stubborn determination. His black hair was long and thick, fanning out across her pillow. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps around 30. There was a power in his stillness, an undeniable nobility that defied the crude caricatures she had heard all her life. On the evening of the 4th day, the fever broke. He awoke not with a start, but with a slow, deliberate opening of his eyes. They were dark, the color of wet earth, and for the first time they were clear and focused. They fixed on her intelligent and assessing. He took in the log walls, the hearth, the woman sitting in a chair beside him. His voice, when it came, was a low rasp, thick with disuse. "Where?" "You're safe," Bess said softly, her voice catching slightly. "You're at my ranch. I found you by the river." He looked at the clean bandage on his side, then back at her. A long moment of silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. "You pulled the arrow," he stated more than asked. "I did." His gaze was intense, searching. "Why?" Bess met his eyes without flinching. "I couldn't just leave you to die." A flicker of something, gratitude, surprise, perhaps something else, entirely passed through his eyes. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "My name," he said, his voice gaining a little strength, "is Tavibo." "I'm Bess McAllister," she replied, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. He was going to live, and she had just given a name to the danger she had invited into her home. A fragile peace settled over the small cabin in the week that followed. The rhythm of Bess's life slowly returned, but it was a new rhythm now marked by the presence of another. Tavibo, as he called himself, was a quiet patient. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but his eyes missed nothing. He watched her as she moved about the cabin, kneading dough for bread, mending a tear in her dress, cleaning her rifle with practiced efficiency. There was a deep, observant intelligence in his gaze that was both unsettling and intriguing. He was recovering with a speed that astonished her. The deep wound that should have killed him was already beginning to knit a testament to a constitution forged in a life of hardship. Soon he was able to sit up on his own, and then to stand leaning against the wall for support. The power she had sensed in him was becoming more apparent with each passing day, a quiet, coiled strength that radiated from him, even in his weakened state. Their conversations were sparse islands of words in an ocean of shared silence. He asked about her ranch, about her life alone. She answered simply, without self-pity. In return, she learned little about him. He said his people were camped many days' ride to the north, that he had been hunting when he was separated from his party and ambushed. He did not say who had ambushed him or why. He was a man who held his secrets close, and Bess, respecting his reticence, didn't pry. Yet a bond was forming. It was in the way he would thank her for a bowl of stew, with a solemn nod of his head, the gratitude in his dark eyes, more eloquent than words. It was in the way she found herself leaving a dipper of fresh, cool water on the table for him before she went out to do her morning chores. It was a connection forged not in language, but in the shared space of survival, in the quiet respect one solitary soul could have for another. She was beginning to see the man, not the label the world had pinned on him. This delicate tranquility was shattered one afternoon by the sudden, violent sound of approaching horses. It wasn't the sound of a lone rider. It was the thunder of a posse, fast and aggressive. A knot of pure dread tightened in Bess's stomach. She looked at Tavibo, who had risen to his feet, his face a mask of grim alertness. He moved instinctively toward the corner where his bow and the few arrows she had recovered lay. "Stay back," she commanded, in a low, urgent whisper, moving to stand in the doorway. 4 riders reined in before her cabin, their horses kicking up a choking cloud of dust. The man in the lead was Caleb Braxton, a big, broad-shouldered rancher from near Redemption. Braxton's face was a permanent thundercloud, his eyes small and mean, and his hatred for the Comanche was legendary, born of a long-ago raid where he'd lost his brother. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, and to him any Native American was a target. Braxton's malevolent gaze swept past Bess and fixed on Tavibo, who was partially visible in the dim interior of the cabin. A cruel, triumphant smile twisted his lips. "Well, well," Braxton snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Look what the cat dragged in. We've been tracking you, you murdering filth." Bess stepped fully onto the porch, blocking the doorway with her body. "He's under my care, Caleb," she said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "He's been wounded. He's no threat to you." "No threat?" One of Braxton's men, a weaselly fellow named Miller, scoffed. "He's a Comanche. His whole existence is a threat. We heard you were harboring him, McAllister. Didn't want to believe a decent white woman could sink so low." "I found him half dead," Bess retorted, her anger rising to meet theirs. "What I did was an act of Christian charity, something you might not understand." Braxton dismounted, his movements slow and menacing. He hitched his gun belt, a deliberate gesture of intimidation. "Charity. You call giving aid and comfort to the enemy charity. That animal is part of the band that hit the Germans' homestead last month. Left 'em for the crows. You have no proof of that, Bess shot back. He's been here recovering for more than a week. He's a Comanche, Braxton repeated, as if that were the only fact that mattered. He took a step toward the porch. Now you step aside, Bess. We're here to deliver some long-overdue justice. We'll give him a trial, a short one at the end of a rope. Tavibo moved silently out of the shadows to stand just behind Bess. He was still weak, but he stood tall, his eyes burning with a cold fire that met Braxton's hateful glare without a flicker. The air crackled thick with the promise of violence. Bess could feel the tension in the man behind her, a lethal stillness that was more frightening than any shout. "You'll do no such thing," a new voice cut in, calm and authoritative. All heads turned. A single rider was approaching at a steady canter. It was Elias Vance, another local rancher whose land bordered Bess's. Vance was the opposite of Braxton in every way. He was a thoughtful, fair-minded man, in his 50s, widely respected for his wisdom and his efforts to maintain a fragile peace in the territory. Vance brought his horse to a halt, his clear blue eyes taking in the scene with a quick, astute glance, Braxton and his armed men, Bess standing defiantly on her porch and the proud wounded Native American behind her. "Braxton," Vance said, his tone even. "What's the meaning of this? You're on McAllister's land, threatening a woman." "I'm here for him, Vance," Braxton growled, gesturing with his chin toward Tavibo. "He's a killer, and she's hiding him." "And what evidence do you have of that?" Vance asked, dismounting and walking closer. "Aside from his heritage?" "He's a Comanche," Miller piped up again. "That's all the evidence we need." Vance gave Miller a look that silenced him. "That's not how we do things, and you know it. We're not a lynch mob." He turned his attention to Bess. "Bess, what's the story?" Bess quickly explained, her voice gaining confidence under Vance's steady gaze. She told them how she had found Tavibo, how he was near death, and how she had cared for him. She spoke of his quiet conduct, stressing that he had offered no violence. Vance listened patiently, then looked at Tavibo, studying him for a long moment. "This man is wounded, and under this woman's protection," Vance said, finally turning back to Braxton. "We don't dispense justice by dragging a man from his sickbed. It's not right." Braxton spat on the ground. "You and your high-minded talk, Vance. It'll get us all killed one day. And your brand of blind hatred will start a war none of us can win," Vance countered coolly. "You have no warrant. You have no real proof. All you have is suspicion. Now I suggest you and your men ride on out of here. Let the man heal. If there's a real case to be made against him, we'll see it's handled by the marshal in Fort Worth, not by a mob." Braxton looked from Vance's resolute face to the cold fury in Tavibo's eyes, and then to his own men who were beginning to look uncertain under Vance's authoritative gaze. He was outmaneuvered. With a final venomous glare, he jabbed a finger at Bess. "You've made a powerful enemy today, woman. And when his people come riding down on this valley, you remember who you sided with." He swung himself back onto his horse. "We'll be watching," he snarled at Tavibo. "One wrong move." With that, Braxton and his posse wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a simmering silence in their wake. Elias Vance turned to Bess, his expression softening with concern. "You took a hell of a risk, Bess." "He's a man, Elias," she said simply, her body trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. Vance nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to Tavibo, who had not relaxed his stance. "That he is," Vance said thoughtfully. "But in this part of the country, that might not be enough to keep him alive." The confrontation with Caleb Braxton changed the atmosphere in the cabin. The fragile unspoken truce with the outside world had been broken, and the walls of Bess's home no longer felt like a sanctuary, but like the center of a gathering storm. The danger was no longer a vague possibility. It had a name and a face. This shared peril, however, had an unexpected effect. It chipped away at the reserve that had separated Bess and Tavibo, pulling them into a closer, more honest alliance. As Tavibo's strength fully returned, their conversations deepened. He began to share more about himself, not in long speeches, but in small, carefully chosen fragments. He spoke of the Comanche, the vast domain of his people, describing the sea of grass that rolled to the horizon and the sacred mesas that touched the sky. He spoke of the buffalo as a spiritual brother, the source of life, and of the horse as an extension of a warrior's own soul. His words painted a picture of a world so different from her own, yet one governed by its own strict codes of honor and a profound connection to the earth. Bess, in turn, found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone since Robert's death. She spoke of her life in Missouri, of the dream that had brought them west, and of the deep, aching void his passing had left. She spoke of her faith, her fears, and the stubborn streak of independence that kept her rooted to this lonely patch of land. They were two people from disparate worlds, finding common ground in their shared experiences of loss, resilience, and solitude. One evening, as a cool breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood outside, Tavibo finally told her about the ambush. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, but his eyes held a distant, cold anger. "It was not your people," he said, looking into the dancing flames of the hearth. "It was Apache, a small war party seeking to make mischief. They want the whites to blame the Comanche for every attack. It weakens us both." He then revealed the true reason he had been in the area. "There is a rancher south of here. His name is Henry Wallace. He is an old man, and they say he is a man of his word. I was riding to a secret parley with him, to talk of peace, to make an agreement for my people to hunt the southern range without conflict. The revelation struck Bess with the force of a physical blow. The man she had saved, the man Braxton had branded a murderer, was a peacemaker. Her intuition, her act of compassion, had been vindicated in a way she could never have imagined. A fierce, protective loyalty surged within her. He was not just a patient anymore. He was a man she respected, a man whose mission of peace had nearly cost him his life. Their new understanding, however, was a secret known only to them, and the four walls of the cabin. The world outside remained steeped in suspicion, and that suspicion was about to find a voice. Dorothy Gable was a widow from a neighboring homestead who made it her business to know everyone else's. She was a woman whose piety was matched only by her insatiable curiosity. Once a week she would ride over to Bess's ranch with a basket of eggs and a mind full of gossip, a visit Bess tolerated with weary resignation. On this particular Wednesday, Dorothy arrived earlier than usual. As she trotted her horse into the yard, she glanced toward the cabin window. The sight that met her eyes made her pull up short, her mouth falling open. Inside, she saw Bess at the table laughing at something the Comanche man, now looking strong and healthy, had said. He was sitting opposite her, mending a tear in his buckskin shirt, with a needle and thread as comfortable and at home as if he were the man of the house. Dorothy didn't even dismount. The image of the domestic scene, the white widow and the Comanche warrior, sharing a moment of levity, was so scandalous, so contrary to the natural order of her world, that it sent a jolt of righteous indignation through her. She wheeled her horse around and galloped back toward redemption, as if the devil himself were at her heels. The story spread through the small town like a prairie fire. Dorothy Gable, breathless and horrified, recounted her tale in the general store, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. She didn't just report what she saw, she embroidered it, painting a lurid picture of impropriety and betrayal. By the time the sun set, the entire town was buzzing with the news. Bess McAllister, the quiet widow, wasn't just harboring a savage. She was living with him. The whispers solidified into hard, ugly certainties. The men in the saloon, fueled by cheap whiskey and Caleb Braxton's inflammatory rhetoric, found their darkest suspicions confirmed. Braxton seized the opportunity, his voice booming across the smoke-filled room. "I told you," he bellowed, slamming his fist on the bar. "She's been corrupted by him. He's got some kind of heathen hold on her. While we mourn our dead, she's laughing with one of the very devils who plague us. Fear is a potent poison. It twists logic and deafens reason." The memory of past raids, the constant low-grade anxiety of frontier life, and the deep-seated prejudice against the Comanche all coalesced into a single ugly point of focus, the man in Bess McAllister's cabin. He became the symbol of all their fears, and she his accomplice. A grim consensus was reached. They couldn't trust Elias Vance's cautious approach or the slow-moving wheels of official justice. They were the law here. They would ride out to the McAllister ranch, put an end to this scandal, and rescue Bess from her own folly. And they would deliver their own swift, brutal justice to the Comanche. As twilight bled across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of purple, and blood orange, a posse of more than 20 men gathered in the main street of Redemption. They were armed with rifles, shotguns, and a collective self-righteous fury. Their faces were grim, their eyes hard. Led by Caleb Braxton, they mounted their horses and rode out into the deepening dusk, a silent, menacing column of vengeance moving across the plains. Inside the small cabin, blissfully unaware of the approaching storm, Bess and Tavibo sat in the quiet companionship they had come to cherish, the light of a single lantern casting a warm, golden glow upon them. The fragile peace was about to be shattered forever. The night was still broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone coyote. The peaceful quiet was a lie. It was torn apart by the sudden percussive thunder of dozens of hooves, a sound that rose from the darkness like a war drum. It was the sound of a mob. Bess's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. Tavibo was on his feet in an instant, his body taut, every muscle coiled. He moved with a liquid grace to the corner, where his bow and quiver rested his movements, economical and deadly serious. The time for healing was over. He was a warrior once more. "They've come back." Bess breathed, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. "And they have brought more men," Tavibo said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Torches flared to life in the darkness outside, casting wild, dancing shadows that turned the familiar landscape into a hellish tableau. The riders swarmed around the small cabin, their faces illuminated in the flickering light, faces twisted with anger, fear, and a grim determination. Caleb Braxton sat on his horse at the forefront, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, his expression one of triumphant malice. "McAllister," his voice boomed thick with menace, "send out the savage. We know you're in there. The whole town knows of your shame. We're here to end it." Bess took a deep breath, her fear solidifying into a cold, hard knot of defiance. She would not let these men in their blind hatred do this. She strode to the door and flung it open, stepping out onto the porch to face them. The lantern light from inside spilled out around her, framing her in a halo of gold. "There is no shame in my house, Caleb Braxton," she called out, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Only a man I have kept from dying. Go home. You have no right here." Tavibo appeared in the doorway behind her, a silent, imposing shadow. He held the bow loosely in one hand, an arrow in the other. He did not aim it, but its presence was a clear and unambiguous statement. The sight of him armed and ready sent a fresh wave of rage through the mob. "Look at him," someone yelled, "ready to kill just like the rest of his kind." "Step away from him, Bess," Braxton commanded. "That's my final warning. We will not ask again. Give him to us, or we'll burn this cabin to the ground with both of you inside." The men began to dismount their boots, thudding on the hard-packed earth. They spread out, forming a semicircle, their rifles and shotguns all pointed at the small porch. The moment was stretched taut, a fragile thread ready to snap. Bess stood her ground. "You will not touch him. To get to him, you'll have to come through me." Braxton laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Have it your way." He started to raise his shotgun, but before he could, Tavibo stepped forward, moving in front of Bess. He held up his empty hand, a universal sign for parley. His movement was so unexpected, so bold, that it momentarily arrested the mob's forward momentum. Then he spoke. His voice was not the guttural grunt they expected. It was clear, resonant, and carried across the yard in flawless, unaccented English. "I am the man you seek," he said, his gaze sweeping across their stunned faces. "But I am not the man you think I am." A wave of shocked silence rolled through the posse. They stared slack-jawed at the Comanche warrior who spoke their language better than some of them did. "My name is Tavibo," he continued, his voice calm and commanding. "I did not attack the German homestead. I have killed no white women or children. I was ambushed by Apache warriors, enemies to you and to my people. This woman, Bess McAllister, saved my life. She showed me a compassion your leader here seems to lack." He cut a sharp glance at Braxton. "You speak of justice." Tavibo went on, his voice ringing with conviction. "But what you seek is not justice. It is vengeance. You would kill an innocent man to satisfy your hatred. Is this the way of honorable men?" His words, logical and eloquent, struck a chord of uncertainty in some of the men. They glanced at each other, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. They had come expecting a cornered animal, not a statesman. Braxton, seeing his control over the mob begin to slip, quickly recovered. "Lies," he roared. "It's a trick. He's a silver-tongued devil trying to save his own skin. Don't listen to him. He's still a Comanche." His words were like a splash of oil on a dying fire, and the flames of hatred flared anew. The men raised their rifles again, their brief moment of uncertainty washed away by a fresh wave of manipulated fury. "That's enough!" The shout came from the darkness behind the mob. A second group of riders was galloping into the yard, their horses thundering to a halt. It was Elias Vance, and behind him were 6 of his own ranch hands, all armed and looking grimly determined. They wedged their horses between the mob and the cabin, creating a much-needed buffer. "Braxton, have you lost your mind?" Vance demanded, his face a mask of cold fury. "I warned you about this. This is not the law. This is a lynch mob. Stay out of this, Vance." Braxton shot back, his face livid. "This is town business. This man has just made a claim of innocence," Vance said, gesturing toward Tavibo. "And he deserves the chance to prove it. We are not murderers." "We'll take him to redemption," Vance declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We will hold a public hearing. He will have his say, and we will get to the bottom of this. We will send for Henry Wallace. If this man's story about a peace parley is true, Wallace will confirm it. We will do this with order and reason, not with torches and rope." Braxton looked at Vance's determined men, then at his own posse, who now looked confused and divided. He was outnumbered, and outmaneuvered once again. A public hearing was a risk, but defying Elias Vance, and his men could lead to a small-scale range war right here and now. With a snarl of frustration, he lowered his shotgun. "Fine," he spat. "We'll take him to town. He can tell his pretty lies to everyone. And when they see him for what he is, I'll be the one to kick the barrel out from under him." The immediate threat of bloodshed had passed, but as Bess watched them prepare for the tense ride to redemption, she knew the fight was far from over. Tavibo was no longer her secret patient. He was a public prisoner, and his life now depended on the fickle and fearful heart of a town that had already condemned him. The journey to redemption was a procession of simmering hostility. Tavibo rode his own horse, a concession Elias Vance had insisted upon, but he was surrounded. Vance and his men formed a protective inner circle, while Braxton and the rest of the mob trailed them like hungry wolves, their faces sullen, their hands never far from their weapons. Bess rode beside Vance, her gaze constantly flickering toward Tavibo. He rode with his back straight, his expression unreadable, a figure of immense dignity in the face of such profound animosity. The pre-dawn light cast long skeletal shadows across the plains, mirroring the grim mood of the riders. As they entered the town's main street, it seemed the entire population of Redemption had turned out. Faces peered from windows and doorways, a sea of expressions ranging from morbid curiosity to outright hatred. The whispers followed them like a swarm of insects. The saloon, which served as the town's all-purpose public house, had been hastily designated as the site for the hearing. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of stale whiskey, sawdust, and unwashed bodies. Men packed the room, standing shoulder to shoulder, leaving a small, clear space in the center. There was no judge, no jury, just a crowd of angry, frightened settlers who had already appointed themselves both. Elias Vance stood on a chair and called for order, his powerful voice cutting through the murmur. "We are here to listen," he declared, "not to shout. This man Tavibo has made a claim. He says he was not involved in the attack on the Germans' homestead, and that he was here to seek a peace parley with Henry Wallace. I have sent a rider to fetch Wallace from his ranch. Until he arrives, this man has the right to speak, and we have a duty to hear him out." Tavibo was led to the center of the room. He stood alone, unarmed, surrounded by his accusers. He met their hateful stares, not with fear or defiance, but with a calm, steady gaze. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the packed room. He told his story again, simply and directly. He spoke of the Apache ambush, of Bess's kindness, and of his mission. He didn't plead for his life. He stated the facts as he knew them. "My people do not want this war," he finished. "Too many have died, on both sides. I came seeking a path to peace. I did not come seeking to make more widows and orphans." His words and the sheer unexpected force of his character had an effect. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably. The seeds of doubt that had been planted at the cabin began to sprout. This was not the bloodthirsty savage of their nightmares. Caleb Braxton, sensing the shift in the room, stepped forward. "Pretty words," he roared. "Words are cheap. He's a Comanche. Deceit is their mother's milk. He talks of peace while his brothers sharpen their lances. He's lying to save his own neck." He began to list every Comanche raid, real or rumored, from the past 5 years. His voice rising with each atrocity, skillfully fanning the embers of fear and grief back into a raging fire. He was a master of manipulation, and the crowd began to sway back toward him, their brief moment of reason eclipsed by a tidal wave of old hatreds. The saloon doors swung open. An old man with a long white beard and clear, honest eyes stood on the threshold. It was Henry Wallace. Vance's rider had found him. A hush fell over the room as Wallace walked slowly to the center, his gaze falling on Tavibo. "Henry," Vance said respectfully. "Do you know this man?" Wallace studied Tavibo for a long moment. "I don't know his face," he said, his voice raspy with age. "But I was expecting him. We were to meet. I received word through a trusted channel. A message that a Comanche leader, a man who spoke for many, wanted to talk about grazing rights and passage, to avoid more bloodshed." A collective gasp went through the room. It was true. Braxton's face went pale, then purpled with rage. "You were conspiring with them, old man. I was trying to keep my family and my men from being killed." "Caleb," Wallace retorted sharply. "Something you seem determined to provoke." The mood in the room had shifted decisively. The foundation of Braxton's argument had crumbled. Tavibo was not a random raider. He was an envoy. The men looked at Braxton, then at Tavibo, and then at the floor, their certainty shaken. Bess felt a surge of hope, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. It was in that precise moment that the saloon doors burst open again. A young man, his face white with terror and his clothes torn, stumbled into the room. It was a rider from an outlying ranch. "Comanches!" he screamed, gasping for breath. "They've just hit the Black Creek crossing wagons on fire. They've killed the whole Perkins family." Pandemonium erupted. The fragile hope shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. All the fear, the doubt, the rage came roaring back with the force of a flash flood. The news was a confirmation of their worst fears, a visceral, bloody validation of Braxton's every hateful word. All eyes snapped back to Tavibo. The looks on their faces were no longer questioning. They were murderous. "A peace envoy!" Braxton shrieked, his voice dripping with triumphant venom. "He's a decoy. He was stalling for time, keeping us all here in town while his warriors did their bloody work. I told you what he was—" He lunged forward his hands, reaching for Tavibo's throat. "Hang him! Hang him now!" The cry was taken up by the mob. The hearing was over. The verdict had been delivered in blood at Black Creek. There would be no more talk, no more reason. There would only be the rope. Chaos consumed the saloon. The veneer of civility, thin as it was utterly stripped away. It was a mob once more, a single entity moved by a singular, bloodthirsty purpose. Caleb Braxton and 2 of his men grabbed Tavibo, dragging him toward the door. His quiet dignity was gone, replaced by a fierce, desperate struggle against the men who were determined to see him hang. "No!" Bess screamed, shoving her way through the press of bodies. She reached the door just as they were hauling him out into the harsh morning light. "You can't do this. He's innocent." Elias Vance was right behind her, his face grim. "Listen to me," he yelled, trying to make himself heard over the roar of the crowd. "This changes nothing. We don't know who was responsible for the Black Creek attack. This is not justice." But no one was listening. They were already dragging Tavibo toward the large oak tree in the center of town, its thickest branch scarred by the ropes of previous judgments. Someone threw a rope over the limb. A noose was quickly fashioned. Bess and Elias Vance threw themselves in front of Tavibo, physically blocking Braxton's path. "If you want him, you'll go through us," Vance said, his voice low and deadly serious, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His own ranch hands moved to flank him, creating a small, defiant island in the sea of rage. For a terrifying moment, the West was poised on its most familiar precipice, a gunfight in a dusty street. Braxton's face was a mask of pure hatred. He was ready to kill them all, to get to the man he blamed for everything. It was then that a new sound cut through the clamor. It was a low rhythmic vibration, a sound felt as much as heard. It grew steadily, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. Every man in the street, including Braxton, fell silent, looking around in confusion. And then they saw it. On the high ridge that overlooked the town of Redemption, silhouetted against the bright morning sun, a line of riders had appeared. There were not 10 or 20. There were hundreds. They sat on their war ponies, motionless and silent, an army of ghosts materializing from the empty plains. Each man held a lance or a rifle. They were painted for war. They were Comanche. A collective gasp of pure terror swept through the crowd. This was not a raiding party. This was a nation. The townsfolk were frozen, their lust for vengeance instantly replaced by a primal, paralyzing fear. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and utterly trapped. One warrior detached himself from the silent line on the ridge. He rode down the slope, not with the speed of an attack, but with a slow, deliberate purpose. He was a magnificent, fearsome sight, his face painted in stark black and white, a full eagle feather headdress trailing behind him. He carried a long lance, adorned with a banner Bess didn't recognize. He rode directly into the center of the tense standoff, ignoring the terrified settlers as if they were nothing more than rocks or scrub brush. He brought his pony to a halt, and his piercing eyes that had seen 1,000 battles fixed upon the man held by Caleb Braxton. A look of disbelief, then profound relief crossed the warrior's face. He slid from his horse and took a knee, bowing his head. Then he spoke, his voice filled with a deep, resonant reverence that carried across the unnaturally silent street. He spoke in the Comanche tongue, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Petanocona," he said, using a name of legendary power. "My chief, we had thought you were lost." The world stopped. Caleb Braxton's hands fell away from the man he was about to hang, as if he'd been burned. The man they called Tavibo. The man they had beaten, accused, and were moments from lynching. He was not just a warrior. He was not just an envoy. He was Petanocona, the Iron Wolf, the paramount war chief of the entire Comanche Nation. The man whose name was a legend, a terror, and a source of awe across the whole of the Southwest. The army on the ridge was not a raiding party. It was a search party. His search party. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. The mob was no longer a mob. They were hostages, their lives hanging by the thread of a single man's will, the very man whose life they had just tried to take. Iron Wolf Petanocona slowly straightened up. The weariness and the strain of his ordeal fell away from him like a snake shedding its skin. He seemed to grow taller, his presence expanding to fill the entire street. The quiet dignity he had possessed was now revealed for what it truly was, the absolute, unshakable authority of a king. He looked at the terrified face of Caleb Braxton, and Braxton physically recoiled, stumbling backward. He looked at the townsfolk who were shrinking away, trying to make themselves invisible. His gaze finally rested on Bess, and in his eyes she saw not a stranger, but the man she had nursed, the man she had defended. And in them she saw a flicker of profound, silent gratitude. He spoke, and his voice was no longer the quiet tone of a peacemaker. It was the voice of command. He issued a short, sharp order in Comanche. On the ridge the army remained still, but their lances lowered slightly. They would await his command. War or peace for redemption rested on his next words. "You sought justice, Caleb Braxton." Iron Wolf said, his English now imbued with a cold, terrifying power. "Now you will have it. My justice." He turned to the crowd. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing through the street as he gestured to Bess, showed me the honor of a true human being. This man, he nodded to Elias Vance, showed me the wisdom of a true leader. His eyes swept over the rest of them. Showed me the heart of frightened children, quick to hate what you do not understand. My warriors are ready to burn this town to the ground and salt the earth where it stood, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. And by our laws they would be justified, but my life was saved in this valley by an act of grace. That grace will be this town's salvation. There will be a peace, he declared. It will be my peace, on my terms. You will respect our borders. You will trade fairly. Caleb Braxton will leave this territory by sundown and never return. If I ever see his face in the Comanche again, I will claim it. This is the only warning he will receive. He walked over to Bess, standing before her. Your kindness, Bess McAllister, has saved more lives today than you will ever know, he said softly for her ears only. You have a warrior's heart. With a final meaningful look that conveyed a world of unspoken understanding, he turned, mounted his horse, and gave a signal to the warrior who had knelt before him. Together they rode toward the ridge, rejoining the silent waiting army. And then, as one, the entire force turned and melted back into the plains, disappearing as mysteriously as they had arrived. In the stunned silence of the street, Bess McAllister stood no longer just a lonely widow, but a woman who had tended a stranger's wounds, and in doing so, had rewritten the fate of the entire frontier. A single act of courage, born from the heart of a lone woman on the unforgiving plains, did more than save one man's life. It held back the tide of a bloody war. Bess McAllister's choice to see a human being instead of an enemy forged an unlikely bridge between two worlds, proving that even in the darkest of times, compassion can be the most powerful force on the frontier. Her story is a testament to the fact that history is not only shaped by great battles and famous men, but by the quiet, defiant choices of ordinary people. If this story of unlikely courage and the clash of cultures in the American West captured your imagination, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this video with fellow history and drama lovers, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the Wild West. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. What would you have done in Bess's place? Let us know in the comments below. We read everyone.